Subscribe to our YouTube channel and press the bell icon to get the latest updates.
The Print off the Cuff, presented by IIFL Wealth and Asset Management. Corporate partner AU Small Finance Bank, in association with global insurance brokers. Airline partner SpiceJet.
Welcome to this edition of Off the Cuff, and we have as our guest a brilliant strategic scholar, Ashley Tellis, of Indian origins but with an American heart and mind, or Ashley, a little bit of Indian heart as well.
Well, thank you, Shekhar. It's great to be here. It's wonderful to be seeing you across the screen. I look forward to this conversation.
And you know what happens when you host a friend of many, many years, then you forget some of the basics of interviewing. One of which is to introduce him properly, because you presume that because you know him so well, everybody knows him so well. So this is Ashley Tellis, strategic scholar, author, thinker, diplomat, currently senior fellow at Carnegie Endowment for International Peace, for International Security, International Affairs, and Asia Affairs, and really an India, South Asia subcontinent expert. But when we say subcontinent expert and we say strategic scholar, then you are not talking about just what's happening on the line of control and how many Lashkar terrorists came into India and how many were killed, etc., etc. You're looking at the big picture. So Ashley, we are so privileged to have you on Off the Cuff.
Oh, it's my privilege. It's great to be here.
So look at India and look around India. And look at India's problems at this point from Washington and give me an overview.
Well, this is certainly a very difficult moment for India, seen from Washington. There has been an economic slowdown now that has gone on for many years. And if India does not recover, it has the potential to undermine, India's attractiveness as a growing power. If you remember, in the last decade, the Bush administration made this huge bet on India because there was an assumption that India was going to grow, continue to grow, become a major economic center in the world, and would continue to remain a friend of the United States. Now, thankfully, the friend of the United States part is still, in relatively good health. But the questions of India's economic slowdown are really troublesome. The pandemic has only complicated things. And so there is a hope that India will come out of this quickly, because if it doesn't, it actually undermines a very important objective that Washington has had now for almost 24 years, which is to maintain a balance of power in Asia with India as one of the critical poles. So for India's sake, and certainly for our sake, we want India to make a comeback.
Now, let me get into the deeper aspect of this. If this is Washington's objective, then why India? Why isn't Japan good enough for this?
Japan is very important, and we have a very special relationship with Japan because it is a long-standing ally. And no matter what we do with India, the US relationship with Japan and Australia will always be special because of those alliance ties. But we see the challenge that China poses to the larger Asian order as being significant enough that we cannot exclude India from the equation. So we want India as the closest partner we can, that we can sort of create. Obviously, India has a choice. India has to make its own decisions here. But we cannot create an effective Asian balance of power without India right there in the middle of the game.
And the two countries have moved much closer to that under President Trump and Narendra Modi.
That is absolutely right. In fact, I think the way Prime Minister Modi disarmed President Trump right from the beginning of his presidency was really a quite spectacular act of statesmanship. I think he read the president right, and he reached out to him because he realized that building that personal relationship was critical to overcoming many of the nettlesome issues that would confront the two countries. And I would say for most part, he succeeded. because even when our differences have been greatest, for example, on the economy, the Trump administration did not treat India as an inveterate adversary, as it has done many of our other partners, for example, in Europe. So to that degree, I think Prime Minister Modi's strategy was on the point and very effectively executed.
Who would you give greater credit to? Narendra Modi or to Trump for this momentum, or Xi Jinping for this momentum in the relationship?
Well, every one of them seems to have played a part in this drama. But I would point to three things that probably made the difference. First was, of course, Prime Minister Modi's initiative in reaching out to Trump very early at a time when the administration's views of India had not been congealed. And, being sort of first out of the gate made a huge difference. The second were the developments that occurred within the Trump administration itself, especially in the first year. Remember, this was an administration that did not have traditional Republican foreign policy officials in place because of the surprise of the Trump victory. And so you had a group of people like Tillerson, like Mattis and McMaster, who really were willing to look at India with new eyes. In fact, perhaps more optimistic eyes than most seasoned foreign policy professionals might have looked at India with. And that really helped because they took Trump administration policy in a way that was decisively pro-India, in ways that maybe more seasoned professionals might have been a little reluctant to do. And then the third element was, India is in a very interesting place vis-a-vis the US. It's not a close enough partner that we have an excess of grievances, about, nor is it a close enough trading partner where the deficits really have to keep us up nights and so on and so forth. So India was really in that Goldilocks position where it could enjoy really benefits without many of the liabilities. And I think all these three things came together in a very virtuous way to sustain what I think was a very unlikely, an unlikely relationship in terms of its productivity.
If I can use a Trumpism here, the relationship benefited from the fact that the deep state was not running it anymore under this Republican administration.
Very much so, because by the end of the Obama administration, it's not that the goodwill to India had disappeared or anything of the kind, but I think there was a growing realism about India's limitations. And if you had a continuity of policy where the realism about India's limitations had dominated, I don't think you would have got this, fresh impulse to double down on investing in India. The fact that the Trump administration officials were sort of new to India in many ways gave them that freedom, to start anew with sort of bolder expectations than others might have had. And I think that paid off. That paid off in very useful ways.
So would you list these Indian limitations, and do these still persist or have some been addressed?
No, I think the fundamental limitations still persist. And to my mind, they come in two forms. One are capabilities limitations. And these are limitations both on the economic side, on the military side, and to a lesser degree on the diplomatic side, because India does punch above its weight in terms of its diplomacy. But then there are other reservations which have to do with India's view of itself in the world. And those have not gone away. So for example, the desire to stay completely autonomous at every moment is something that Americans have not quite gotten used to. I mean, we pay lip service to the fact that we respect India's autonomy. But I think in the core of our official mind is this deep desire for a relationship with India that is almost like an alliance without the label. And I think India is still very far away from that relationship. And I think that will continue to remain, a potential impediment as we go forward.
What the old foreign policy establishment or intelligentsia in India calls strategic autonomy.
Yes, indeed.
And do you think it's now become a faltu mantra?
Well, it's certainly become the newest replacement for the label non-alignment. But I am sort of mystified by the concept, because in some sense, India has always been autonomous. It has always been the author of its own decisions. But at the end of the day, you have to make your choices based on your environment. And it seems to me that India's environment has turned in many ways that are unhelpful to India. And India finds itself in a position where it cannot sort of muster the resources by itself to deal with these challenges of the environment, and yet consistently affirms its independence. And it's that contradiction that I find sort of hard to resolve. And I hope it's something that Indians sort of struggle with as well, because unless that contradiction is overcome, India will always find itself in a somewhat difficult place.
Because in this world, and particularly if you are fated to live in this neighborhood, Tagore's line of Ekla Chalo Re is not a good idea.
Absolutely. Absolutely. I keep telling, people, I say this over and over again, that for the first time in India's, 3,000, 4,000-year-old history, there is a superpower on its doorsteps.
Right.
And when you have a superpower on its doorsteps, if you want to be strategically autonomous, then you had better become a superpower yourself, because only power can contend with power. And if you cannot become a superpower yourself, then you have to start looking for friends that will aid you in that effort at balancing the superpower that now lives next door. And India that is betwixt and between, that is neither becoming a superpower itself, nor willing to embrace more wholeheartedly, the far off superpower that might help it do the balancing. I find that to be a sort of perplexing set of choices that India seems determined to make.
Yeah, I know you policy wonks like these expressions, so maybe I'll add one to those: hesitations of history. Has Mr. Modi got rid of those hesitations of history? Or not yet?
Well, he has certainly gotten rid of the hesitations at the level of labels. He has certainly gotten rid of the hesitations at the level of intentionality. I think his government wants to come closer. But every time we take 2 steps forward, we see India taking 1 step back. And I think it is partly because the idea of being autonomous in the sense of being untethered to some outside power is very deeply etched in the foreign policy psyche. I think it goes back, to the legacies of colonialism and so on and so forth. And it's all understandable. But I would say in practical terms, there is still much to be done to overcome those hesitations that, the Prime Minister very boldly announced the end of when he spoke to the Congress many years ago.
Yeah. And we forgot the elephant in the room, as a visiting State Department official described, I think Steve Begun, that is China. So Xi Jinping, what role has Xi Jinping played in ending these hesitations and hypocrisies, if I may say so, of history?
Well, he certainly played a decisive role, because as far as the US was concerned, he forced us to face up to the fact that China is not simply a competitor, but is actually an adversary in many ways. And that if the US order is to survive and American primacy is to be maintained, it's not going to be sufficient to coexist with China, but it will be imperative to defeat China's strategy. And so he's certainly taken, the wool off American eyes where hypocrisy is concerned. Where India is concerned, I think he has pushed India to make some hard choices. He has revealed that China too is India's adversary, not just a competitor. And now everyone is waiting to see, where India comes out of this process. I think thus far, even the Modi government, for all its desires for a closer relationship with the US, has played it with subtlety. In fact, some would say an excess of subtlety. So, the last chapter in this business of how India relates to China and the US has not been written.
So I am very interested in what you said just now. Subtlety and excess of subtlety. So what is the subtlety that he has indulged in or practiced? And where do you think there is an excess of it?
Okay, so the subtlety is that India still finds it difficult to call out China as a strategic rival. It was very interesting to see two documents in the recent few weeks. The statements that were issued after the Quad and the joint statement, the remarks made, at the release of the joint statement by Indian officials and US officials. Both at the Quad and in Delhi at the 2+2, India very studiously refrained from calling out China by name as a strategic threat. And this is literally, a few months after, the Chinese invaded Indian territory and, caused the loss of life of Indian soldiers. The US, on the other hand, was, boldly advertising that China is a strategic competitor and nothing else, right? So that's the part of subtlety, that even in the midst of being pushed to the wall, India still refrained from sort of declaring open season on China. And the excess of subtlety is that I think on many issues where there are bilateral opportunities, I still see India as being reticent. So for example, we have all these foundational agreements now signed. But the simple test for me is if tomorrow the United States and India had to operate together in some part of the world, either for humanitarian reasons or for reasons of national security, after having signed all these agreements, could the US militaries and the Indian militaries actually operate together? And the answer is no. The answer is no, because we have not done many of the things that are necessary to make interoperability real. So we've sort of professed our desire to get to that goal, but we have now been at this for 20 years. And 20 years later, there are still huge divides in terms of the building blocks that we need to work together. And that's what I mean by an excess of subtlety.
So what are the things that we could have done, but we haven't done to make ourselves interoperable, our forces interoperable?
So for example, I think there are big gaps in our communications technologies. We cannot communicate seamlessly to one another when we are in the field. We have to look around for workarounds. We have to look for workarounds to make things work. Second, our doctrines are quite different, and we don't actually even understand them because we've never had a serious, conversation about doctrines. And you can't have two armed forces that expect to work together operating in different styles. So there is a lot more that we have to do to actually make the promise of the partnership real.
Yeah, so going back to Xi Jinping. So my colleague Nainima Basu wants to know, is Xi Jinping the 21st century Mao? To which I will add a supplementary. And do you think Xi Jinping has completely reversed the Mao, Nixon, Kissinger shift in US-Chinese relations? Are we back to 1971 now?
I don't think we are back to 1971, but we may be somewhere between 1971 and 1979, where we see China as a potential problem, but we are not quite ready to embrace it either as an ally, nor are we ready to treat it as a clear enemy. We are somewhere in another world. And I think much is going to depend on the next 4 years and how US-China competition is redefined, because it is certainly going to be redefined. I mean, the Trump approach to US-China competition is not going to survive. And especially if you have a Biden administration, it's going to become much more nuanced. It's going to become much more subtle. And then that will open up a gray area by itself, because it's only going to muddy the waters about China's status in US strategy even more. And so if you are confused today, then brace for even more confusion over the next 4 years.
But going ahead, do you see the US getting tougher with China or softer with China?
I think there will be an effort made to protect equities where we need Chinese cooperation on. So for example, if you go to the transnational arena, and if you look at climate change, if you look at pandemic management, I think these are areas where cooperation with China will be seen as necessary, and efforts at building bridges with China, which I think will occur. The areas where the competition, I think, is going to be most intense is probably in three areas. First, in the area of technology. So technology competition, I think, will be unremitting. There's going to be no change there. Second, in the area of military access in terms of military capabilities, I think that competition too will be unremitting and there won't be any change there. The third area, and I will just put an asterisk to this one, will be in the area of values. That is, the Chinese behavior with respect to its own peoples, the way it treats countries on its periphery. I think these will be areas where there will be competition, but our take on that competition will vary depending on our own equities with the various countries involved, and how far we are willing to push China will be up for grabs. I'll give you a simple example. The Trump administration went out of its way to make the point that it's not simply China that's a strategic adversary, but the Communist Party of China. In fact, trying to drive a cleavage between state and society. I'm not sure that that is a position that will carry over into a Biden administration. We may always be skeptical about the CCP, but I'm not sure that a Biden administration or a future US administration would single out the CCP as the target of US efforts.
Or delegitimize the Chinese government.
That is correct. Correct. You will go back to a Nixonian strategy of dealing with the country as opposed to singling out the regime.
Yeah. So Xi Jinping, the question, is he the Mao of 21st century? And is that a good thing or a bad thing?
Well, it's certainly a new thing because we thought we had put the era of the great man behind us and that Chinese politics was moving more in the direction of collegium politics with a consensus. Xi Jinping has certainly thrown that overboard. We are now back in the era of the great man. And it's not simply in terms of political, capabilities. It's also in terms of what he has done in terms of Xi Jinping thought, enunciating that thought into the constitution and so on and so forth. So if there ever was a cult of personality without being called a cult of personality, it's Xi Jinping.
Yeah, so there is almost like a Xi Jinping Chalisa, as we say, Hanuman Chalisa, that people are supposed to memorize and chant.
That's right.
So what does Xi Jinping want with India? Why has he brought 3 divisions of his army with all the heavy stuff that we haven't seen from the Chinese before, and he's piled them all on our borders just as the winter begins? What does he want?
Well, there is the specific and there is the general.
Yeah.
The specific is that he wants to complete the Chinese reunification project. He sees himself at being at a point in history where Chinese power enables him to complete that reunification project. He sees a world in considerable disarray. He sees the United States as not willing to exhibit global leadership. And so this is a great opportunity from the point of view of Xi Jinping to sort of go out and finally secure what he has believed has always been China's. So I think that is the specific. The more general is that in China's mind, there's also the question of rejuvenation and the recovery of status that China once enjoyed in the international system. And if those dreams have to be realized, there has to be only one axial power in Asia, and that's China. And any other powers that end up posing as pretenders to being China's peers, those powers have to be cut to size. And so he has certainly tried to do that with Japan. He is doing that now with India. So between the general and the specific, you end up in the same place, which is the desire to put India in a box. To show India where its position in the status hierarchy of Asia lie. And that's really
That's one thing. But when you talk of his wanting reunification of China, then does it mean that he would also want all of Arunachal Pradesh? Because right now, what this is about is the 1959 Chinese claim line in
I mean,
Ladakh.
I have no doubt that as long as the Chinese position that Arunachal Pradesh is part of South Tibet holds, he will want it. But I think there are also practicalities here. It's much easier to secure borderlands in Ladakh, where China has some advantages, than to secure the state of Arunachal Pradesh, where there is an Indian presence at great depth. So, there you have to allow also for room for pragmatism here, right? I mean, in many ways, I think Xi is an opportunist. He reacted opportunistically in the West. I'm not sure he will do that in the East only because it's a losing proposition. And he has bigger problems right now. He has problems with Taiwan. He has problems with Japan. He has problems with Hong Kong. But if one were to do a thought experiment and suddenly imagine that all those problems were solved, would he cast a gaze again at Arunachal Pradesh? I would wager that he would.
Good. So now don your hat as a military scholar on the militaries. How has India's response to China been? How would Xi Jinping read it? Would he see India's response as resolute or defensive or cagey or firm?
I think the response so far has been actually very good, because even though India sort of got off to a bad start by not being able to detect the initial incursions, until they had occurred, the fact that India has brought up its forces to the front and refused to succumb to the Chinese effort to impose a fait accompli, I think should send a signal to Xi that this is not going to be a walkover. In effect, what India has done is twofold. It's done something tactical and it's holding the threat of doing something strategic. What it's done at the tactical level is to confront the Chinese on the line. In fact, in some cases, it's gone further than confronting the Chinese. It's secured its own claimed territories, particularly on the south bank of Pangong Tso.
But you are saying that I have no knowledge.
Okay.
You Americans, huh?
And I think that was a clever move because it forces the Chinese now to negotiate on the basis of a quid pro quo. But the strategic play, I think, is equally interesting, because what India is essentially signaling to China is that it can do worse in terms of its alliance shifting if China continues to put India in a corner. And that is the Damocles sword that India is holding over China right now at the strategic level, which is go back to the status quo ante, or consider the possibility that India might do things that are even more dramatic with respect to align with your enemies. And, that's not a bad play for India to engage in at this point in time.
But should India be doing it? I mean, should that be squeeze play? Should that be coercive diplomacy, or should that be for real? I mean, even you Americans will say, hey, India, you are indulging in squeeze play, you are using us to balance China, but what exactly do you want?
Well, I'll give you my view on this, because I can't speak for the US on this question. I worry that this may just be a gambit and not a strategy. That is, the US should have no reservations about being used in this fashion if it advances India's interests, because an advance in Indian interests on this count advances our interests as well. So we shouldn't be bothered about that. But what worries me is that this becomes a gambit that is used for tactical gains and then forgotten when the tactical gains are achieved. And that leaves India in a somewhat awkward position, because the next time around, the US may not be as forthcoming or as supportive if in the interim we do not do what is necessary to build a tighter relationship.
Yeah, and our neighbors will not change. Our neighbors will remain the same.
Without a doubt. Without a doubt.
Look at the relationship in terms of politics, Indian politics and American politics. How immune is it to Indian politics, or how affected is it by Indian politics, or how immune or susceptible it is to American politics?
Well, these are not hermetic. These are not hermetic universes, right? I mean, what happens in India will affect the US. What happens in the US will affect India as well. And my fear is that the US is already a divided government. I mean, it's constitutionally divided. We have a Congress which has its own views. It's a co-equal arm of government, and so on and so forth. It will also be increasingly a politically divided government. Democrats in control of one arm of government, possibly Republicans in control of at least the Senate. So it's unclear to me, even if the executive branch wants to deal with India on purely strategic terms, whether the Congress will allow it to do so. Because the Congress has always been far more attuned to developments in Indian domestic politics than the executive branch has been. I mean, we follow Indian domestic politics closely, yes. But we are capable of sort of averting our eyes to inconvenient realities at the executive branch level. In Congress, the inhibitions are fewer. And so, we could end up in difficult moments, in years to come.
I was talking about politics within our countries influencing our policy. For example, UPA it started very well under Vajpayee. You were in India then. You were working with Ambassador Blackwell then in India. And relationship moved very fast. And then it continued with that momentum, and the nuclear deal happened. Then something got switched off. In fact, would you agree that agreements like LEMOA, BECA, COMCASA, or whatever it's called now, SISMOA, all these could have been signed 15 years earlier?
Yes, I think so. I mean, I always found it curious that India made so much of these agreements. Now, remember, these are, as far as I'm concerned, fairly pedestrian vanilla agreements that the US has with literally dozens of countries. But
57, BECA with India is the 58th in BECA.
Absolutely. I mean, these are not things that people think about. In fact, have you heard of any other bilateral agreement that the US has signed with another country of this kind? No, you won't, because these are all signed as a matter of routine and forgotten. But I think in many of the agreements, what India wanted was changes that would show that these are not one-sided agreements, that these are genuinely agreements between equals. And so a lot of time was spent over the last 15 years sort of coming up with language that would satisfy India's desire to be seen as an equal, that it was not simply a recipient of American largesse, but that it was a full partner. And, at a time when the US had sort of strategic altruism as its broad approach to India, those negotiations were completely palatable. Going forward, I'm not sure that Americans will have the appetite, to spend so much time on things that in the scheme of things will be seen as trivialities.
Yeah. So how did India, do you agree that India switched off after the nuclear deal? Because nuclear deal was a much bigger agreement than all these SISMOAs and BECAs and LEMOAs, etc. So what happened?
No, I don't think India switched off. I think what happened was both sides got comfortable with the idea of the other as a strategic partner. And there were no big sort of startling things left to be done. So in many ways, it was the routinization, the normalization of a relationship, which is a good thing. I mean, a nuclear deal is once in a lifetime kind of thing. You can't do this every few years. But the problem we have now, as I see it, is we need to make good on the promises that we have to each other, which is, we want to be partners. So let's see that happen in the economic realm. Let's see that happen in the military realm. Let's see that happen in terms of, our diplomacy and so on and so forth. I think on those counts, I think progress has been slower than I would like.
Yeah. So Now, you talked about India, India using the leverage with China of being able to enhance its relationship with America, China's adversary. That's a leaf out of Mao's book because Mao said Russia is an immediate threat right on our borders. So make friends with a distant power. Distant power is less of a threat. So we can do that. But when we do that, and suppose it goes in that direction, how do you see Xi Jinping responding?
Well, I think for the moment, I don't think this is going to give Xi Jinping sleepless nights, because one of the things that I find quite interesting in talking to Chinese about this issue is that their absolute conviction that India will never end up being allied with the United States, that India may engage in a dalliance with the United States as circumstances demand, but never a genuine alliance. Now, think about this for a moment. If the Chinese are absolutely convinced that they can count on India's strategic autonomy, then there are really no risks to China in terms of their competition with India. Because they know at the end of the day, after all is said and done, India would prefer to stand apart and stay alone. And if that becomes an article of faith in Beijing, then it opens the door for all kinds of pressures that can be brought on India. And so the question for me is, what can India do to essentially defeat this perception in Beijing? And I think the answer cannot be found in simply more conversations, more diplomacy. It must be found in tangible things that we do together on the ground.
Well, that was precisely the question that YP Rajesh, our managing editor, asked. Now, coming back to the military, I read your chapter in the new collection, new volume that your institution has produced, Carnegie. The chapter is on Indian military. It's headlined, Capable but Constrained. Now, look at India's threat situation and India's opportunities situation. Where is India capable and where is it constrained?
Okay, so I think if you look at the three armed services, for example, I think India has a remarkable edge in the area of air power because both vis-a-vis Pakistan and vis-a-vis China, I think the Indian Air Force has huge advantages that are hard to neutralize. In the area of naval power, I think India also has overwhelming advantages, both against China in the Indian Ocean and of course against Pakistan. And among the smaller states of the region, I think it's essentially a no contest. The biggest challenges that India faces are with respect to ground forces, where both vis-a-vis Pakistan and vis-a-vis China, the best India could do in practical terms is achieve a standoff, but no decisive victory. And the tragedy for me is that the ground forces dominate India's personnel, it dominates India's budgets, and it sort of sucks the oxygen out of the resources that India could use otherwise to deploy its power elsewhere in the world. So in other words, in the one area where India sort of absorbs the most resources, ground forces, the outcomes that it can show are the most meager, which is it can push its two adversaries at best to a draw, but nothing beyond that. And in the two areas where India can do much more with air power and naval power, those arms of the military are actually starved.
So if you were advising India today on military issues, where would you, nothing will happen overnight. But if India were to look at its defense planning for the next 10 years, and India is now looking at military reforms, in fact, even pensions are being debated, then how would you want India to go ahead with this?
So I think there are three areas where I would want to see some movement. First, with respect to budgets. I mean, India, I think, cannot, advance its ambitions in the world with defense budgets at the levels that they currently are. And certainly the internal makeup of the budgets gives you real room for pause when you think in terms of personnel costs and so on and so forth. Now, this takes you straight to the character of India's economy and India's economic growth and so on and so forth, right? So I would like to see some progress made with respect to financing, defense financing. The second area would have to be with respect to organization. And India can really realize economies, operational economies, through greater jointness. And India has begun to move in that direction, but not sufficiently so. So I wait for the day when India can move to truly jointmanship in its warfighting doctrines, in its theater plans, in its organization, and so on and so forth. And then the last area which is again a function of money and maybe even strategic culture, has to do with changing the man-machine mix. Especially India's ground forces are too manpower dependent. And as long as they are manpower dependent, that outcome of the standoff vis-a-vis its adversaries will remain the outcome. India has to move towards a more capital intensive ground force. Now, this is easy to say, but it's expensive to do that. It requires a different kind of military labor base. That is, you need a different kind of soldiery to be able to use, capital intensive technologies effectively. And it's going to require a much more adventurous, operationally adventurous military leadership. The Indian military leadership is very, very conservative. So those are the three sort of broad areas: budgets, organization, and then changing the man-machine mix that I think India would need to work on.
Does India need a new Sundarji, or do the new current generals have to think like Sundarji?
Well, I don't know if you need to think like Sundarji. I think many of the current generals appreciate the constraints that they have, but they are prisoners of those constraints, which is, unless you're willing to make some bold decisions. I'll give you a very simple example. If the political leadership instructs you that in case of conflict, not 1 inch of Indian territory must be ceded to the enemy, then you have no choice but to do exactly what the Indian military is doing, which is to match the opposition number for number, unit for unit, and so on and so forth. If you're willing to think of a different form of warfare, then it gives you more options. So changes have to come really from the very top. So this is really not a project for a year. This is really a project for a generation.
That's right. That means doctrinal changes have to come at the political level.
Absolutely.
Because we have to also mentally stop living in the battles for mountain outposts of 1962, isn't it?
Absolutely.
But we haven't quite moved on from that.
No, and I think in part this is because of India's, colonial legacies, right? Territory is critical because it defines what a country is. It's so central to the image of what national security is. And therefore, there is a fear that if you lose territory, you'll never get it back. And that has real consequences, politically. And that really crimps the military in terms of what they can do.
Yeah. So, Ashley, before I let you go, you used to be a Republican. Am I right to say that?
No, I've never been a registered Republican, actually. I've just had the
registered Republican, but
working for a Republican president.
But philosophically a Republican, in terms of your own policy understanding.
Let's put it this way, that party no longer exists.
Yes, so that was my question. So what is it that's changed?
Well, what has changed is that the Republican Party that I knew when I first came to the US in the 80s was a party that many people could be very sympathetic with. It was a party that derived, it focused on opportunity for individuals. It focused on keeping a world open to international trade. It focused on American power and American leadership. And it was very welcoming of immigrants because, they saw this as really being the proof that the American dream, was an attractive idea. That party has disappeared. I mean, it's hard to find, the current Republican Party being supportive of any of these ideas that I just outlined. And so I think there are many folks here, especially registered, moderate registered Republicans who find themselves without a home at this point. And it's tragic for American politics, to be honest, because if that vision is lost, then I think America is the poorer for it.
So these are nothing compared to, these are nothing like Reagan's Republicans or Reagan's America that you came to.
No, far from it. In fact, it is hard to recognize in the current Republican Party any of the republicanism that we saw as recently with George W. Bush. Right. I mean, on all the issues that I identified, I mean, Bush's policies were exactly, policies that what we would think of as being moderate Republican policies. But those seem to have disappeared.
So in a post-Trump situation, whatever happens, do you see Republicans going back to how they were, or have they changed forever? And similarly, in case of Biden's rise, do you see Democrats becoming like old Democrats, or do you think Democrats being able to price themselves away from Bernie Sanderism and Republicans being able to break away from Trumpism?
Well, I'm much more optimistic about the Democrats than I am about the Republicans. Because there is still a center in the Democratic Party. There is, of course, a left, but it is a virtuous and a productive fight between the two factions. I mean, they enrich each other, but there is a robust middle, and I think Joe Biden represents that robust middle. I'm pessimistic about the Republicans because this outcome in this election will not demonstrate a conclusive defeat of Trumpism. I mean, Trump will be defeated if the results end up being what we think, they will be. But the fact is that Trumpism appears here to stay. And the fact that the Republicans will control the Senate, will actually have a few more seats in the House, the possibility that Trump will not go quietly into the night, but will continue to behave as previous presidents did not, which is he will stay active in the political arena, making life difficult for his successor. All this gives me reason to believe that, the Republicanism that we see today is here to stay.
Well, it's a tough example to give, tough comparison to give, but I do remember that many decades ago when I went to cover Zia-ul Haq's funeral, people told me that, look, Zia is gone, but Ziaism will live forever and Ziaism will now define Pakistan. And the fact is that more than 3 decades later, Ziaism still defines Pakistan.
That's absolutely true. And, if we are unlucky, that the same may be said about Trumpism.
Yeah. Ashley, I look at you. Are you competing with our Prime Minister, or are you following his example? You could be a Modi lookalike and you could be used in election campaigns in India.
No, the Prime Minister has no competition on that front.
You only need a bullet in the back and you're okay.
No. He has sagacity on his side as well. I have only laziness to account for my beard.
We shall not make that insinuation about him. You are not being sly.
No, it's not.
The Prime Minister is being lazy, so he's grown a beard like this.
Absolutely not. Absolutely not.
So, Ashley, I know that you are an American, but you also came from where you came from. Having lived in America this long and having seen India through so many decades, do you think India is disappointed or underperformed? Or do you think India has actually surprised you on the upside?
Well, a little of both. And this is not surprising, right? India manages to confound both its friends and its skeptics all the time. That's not new. I believe in India's promise. I mean, one of the reasons why I worked for the US-India relationship over the last 2 decades is because I believe you can never count India out. And, democratic societies, liberal societies have that capacity to surprise themselves. And the same is true of the US. I mean, although these are sobering times, I refuse to think that we've somehow lost our way. We will continue to fight our way through this. But I think we will recover, at least if you have a Biden presidency, enough of the mojo, to make a difference, to give people hope that the United States will not sort of, slink away, will not sort of end up succumbing to its worst impulses. I have faith in that process.
Well, I think that's a good note to conclude this on. Ashley, thank you very much. Thanks for your patience. And when we meet next, I hope you have a bullet to rival Mr. Modi's as well.
I look forward to that, Shekhar. I look forward to seeing you in person. It has been far too long.
Absolutely.
Stay safe, and all your readers, take care of yourselves.
Stay well. Thank you.
Bye-bye. Bye-bye.